Good morning, everyone. My name is Arjun, and we are going to present to you the correlational research method, which is going to be presented by once again me, Luis Lane Mercado, and Christine May Gintos. We are going to talk about the hows, the whys, the what, the definition of the correlational research. In this page, we can see the tables of content, which is going to be the overview for this research method. For the first topic, we are going to talk about the types, the correlational research method itself, the data analysis methods, the applications of correlational research, how to conduct this type of research method, the purpose of correlational research, the examples of correlational research, of course, and when do you use the correlational research method. In this next slide as well, we are going to also talk about its characteristics, which is actually really important for us to know, and its differences with quasi and experimental design. So what makes these three actually very different? And lastly, advantages and limitations of using correlational research. For us to know about the basics of correlational research, we have to go deep dive on the introduction first for this topic. So defining correlational research, that this is a type of research that examines the statistical relationship between two or more variables without manipulating them. This is a non-experimental research design that seeks to establish the degree of association or correlation between two or more variables. What this means, basically, or in short terms, is that correlational research is a type of research wherein we get to observe or record data for two or more variables without any manipulation, and we have to think if there are any correlation or there are any factors affecting the correlation and why this makes sense for a particular phenomena that we are trying to research about. So, of course, knowing about the definition of correlational research, we are also going to talk about the three types of correlational research: the positive correlation, the negative correlation, and the zero correlation. All of these three has something to do with statistics. So, it would not be that complicated to know about these terms, but let's just chill, as this is just going to be related with statistics. So what you can see on the screen right now or in this slide right now, positive correlation just means that whenever a variable's value goes up, the other variable also goes up, or vice versa, meaning that if the other variable goes down, the other variable also goes down, meaning that for whatever effect that the first variable has, or for whatever value that the first variable has, when we plot it on a chart or when we plot it on a scatter plot, the value also rises, meaning that the effect is directly affected to the variable that we are trying to measure. So reading off the definition of this positive correlation, of course, when two variables increases or decreases together, this means that as one variable increases, the other variable also tends to increase, or vice versa. Similarly, as one variable decreases, the other variable also tends to decrease. For example, we are trying to research about what does it mean to have a good score in an examination. So now we have the data that we are most interested in, the mood and how it affects good scores. So now, without any intervention, we are going to measure how mood affects scores. Now we have found out that if they're in a good mood, most likely they're going to get a good score. This is a positive correlation because if the value of the mood increases, or if they are in a good mood or in a positive mood, they also get a good score. So whatever the effect of the first variable has, it has a direct effect as well on the second variable that we are trying to observe, and the opposite should not happen to it. So talking about opposites, we have negative correlation. For negative correlation, this occurs when one variable increases while the other decreases. This means that as one variable increases, the other variable also tends to decrease. Similarly, as one variable decreases, the other variable tends to increase. What this actually means is that for whatever variable that we are trying to observe, it has a direct opposite effect to the variable that we are also observing. For this example, we are doing a research about IQ and their sociability. Now, when we try to observe these two variables, we have noticed that for someone who has an high IQ or who has an IQ higher above the average IQ, they tend to have low sociability, they tend to have less friends as compared to those with average IQ but they have good sociability. These two variables actually has a negative correlation because again, for whatever increases, the other value decreases. So in this example, high IQ is correlated with low sociability, meaning that if you have a high IQ, you also have a low sociability. High meaning higher in value, and low sociability meaning lower in value, which is why it is called a negative correlation. Talking about the correlations of both positive and negative, we have to also talk about correlations that does not make sense. In this case, we have zero correlation. Zero correlation occurs when there is no relationship between two variables. This means that variables are unrelated and do not affect each other. So in this example, we are trying to measure love and distance, two variables that we are interested about. So when we were trying to observe these two variables, we have noticed that when we plot the chart, the data doesn't make sense. There's no direct effect, there's no opposite effect of each other. It's just that the data doesn't make sense. If the data makes you go, huh, or does not make sense in any possible way, this means that the research that you have right now is a zero correlational one. Alright, so now that we have talked about negative, the positive correlation, and the zero correlation, we now have to talk about the methods on how to get your data. So how are you going to get the positive, the negative, and the zero correlation as your conclusion to your data if you do not know the methods on how to gather your data? So when you try to observe two variables or when you try to record two variables, here are the ways that we can do to get your data for your research. We can do surveys, of course, can be distributed via Google Forms, Microsoft Forms, even in paper, observational studies. We try to observe things directly as they are. Archival data or data that is already there that we just have to dig up could be from the internet, the bookshelves, or magazines. We also have experimental design wherein we implement some sort of manipulation to your constants or manipulation to your variables, and we also have meta-analysis wherein we try to analyze multiple sources of data, except this differs from archival data because you are trying to get data from other research and try to analyze whatever does make sense for the data to be correlated with each other. So of course, we already have the data that we gathered. Now that we have known about zero, negative, and positive correlation, now that we have known about the methods on how to gather your data, now we have to analyze your data that you have. So for the first type of data analysis, we have correlation coefficient, wherein it is a statistical measure that quantifies the strength and direction of the relationship between two variables. The correlation coefficient ranges from -1 to +1, with -1 indicating a perfect negative correlation and +1 indicating a perfect positive correlation, and 0 indicating no correlation. When you try to use Excel, when you try to plot this in a chart, let's just say a scatter plot, you can see that the data is rising, and whatever the data is rising, that just means that you have a +1 data. That means that you have a positive correlation. And when you try to quantify again your data, and you can see that the data are going down, or for whatever data that you're comparing, they are opposite across each other, that means that you have a negative correlation once again. And whatever you're trying to compare two data against one another, and you can see that doesn't make sense or it's all scrambled up, that's 0 or a 0 correlation. So correlation coefficient just means that you're trying to compare data and you have to quantify it for you to draw a conclusion from it. So as I was talking about scatter plots earlier, let me define it first and give you an explanation for it. Why scatter plots are very much an effective or and effective type of data analysis for correlational research method. It is a statistical measure that quantifies the strength and direction of the relationship between two variables. The correlation coefficient, basically what I'm reading right here is the same definition as correlation coefficient, ranges from -1 to +1, with -1 indicating a perfect negative correlation, +1 indicating a perfect positive correlation, and 0 indicating no correlation. So again, the difference with scatter plots and correlation coefficient is that correlation coefficient itself is the chart or the whole of the chart that we are trying to analyze. Whereas with scatter plots, we are trying to look at individual data and how this can be correlated with each other. So when you try to plot something else, when you try to plot two datas in a table, it would look like dots, right? But this time you're going to try to take a look at it as an individual or as an individual data. So you get more analysis for your research method or for the correlational research method that you're using, but this time at an individual level. For the third correlational data analysis method, we have path analysis. This is a statistical method used to model the relationship between two or more variables. Researchers use regression analysis to predict the value of one variable based on the value of another variable. Regression analysis can help identify the strength and direction of the relationship between variables, as well as the degree to which one variable can be used to predict the other. So instead of scatter plots or correlational coefficient where you're viewing the individual as a whole or as individuals, this time for path analysis, for the precedent data that you have, you are going to use it as a way to predict how your data goes or how the next outcome goes. So for example, for precedent 1, we have high IQ, low sociability. Now, you have already the precedent data that high IQ equals low sociability. For your second comparison of the data, you're going to observe again, you're going to do some gathering of the data. With paths analysis, for your second data, you already have a hypotheticals that, hey, for the second comparison of the data, we are going to predict that low IQ equals good sociability, or high IQ equals good sociability. Since you already have a precedent data, it's kind of like you're creating a null hypothesis for the second data that you're going to have. This actually works if your research topic already has a background or a data that you can use as a precedent for you to have a path analysis, because you can't use path analysis if you don't have a precedent data or a precedent conclusion before your research is being made or is being constructed. Factor analysis. This is a statistical method used to identify patterns among variables. Researchers use factor analysis to group variables into factors that are related to each other. Factor analysis can help identify underlying factors that influence the relationship between two variables. So instead of you just trying to identify two variables, whatever the data that you have there is kind of related to each other, if they have a direct opposite or they do not have any relationship to each other, this time you're trying to measure what affects this effect towards two variables or two or more variables that you're trying to observe. For example, you have high IQ equals low sociability. Now, you already have this conclusion. You're now trying to analyze whether there are factors underlying those conclusions that could affect on how those results could came up. So what I'm trying to say is that if you have data that you already have a conclusion about it, once you have the conclusion, you're now trying to determine what could be the factor on knowing that result. So this time you're looking at the data both individually and as a group, but then you also put in an addition of the factors underlying the results that you got for your data analysis. For the applications of correlational research method, This is actually used in psychology to explore the relationship between variables such as personality traits, behaviors, and mental health outcomes. For example, researchers may use correlational research to examine the relationship between anxiety and depression, or the relationship between self-esteem and academic achievement. So, for the past previous examples that we have, for the previous slides, those were actually the most common examples of a psychologist using correlational research method as a leverage to provide a statistical analysis or an inferential or a descriptive analysis of things that may not make sense, but actually they have a correlation with one another. So we psychologists actually use correlational research method for us to take wild guesses on how two variables or two or more variables may have a relationship with one another that we have not expected. But of course, with correlational research method, this actually paves the way for the wild guesses to become conclusions in the future.
Now, we're going to discuss how to conduct correlational research. First is to make claim to create hypothesis. So making a claim or hypothesis is often the first step in any study. In correlational research, there may be or may not be a clear relationship. For example, you can hypothesize the younger people that are most likely or more likely to use digital coupons. So your hypothesis, it can clearly states an assumption about the relationship between two things, identifying both of your variables when creating your hypothesis that can help determine how you might collect your data. Next is to choose a data collection method. So there are a few ways to gather or to collect your data depending on the informations that you have gathered. So the most common methods for correlational research are survey, naturalistic observations, and archival research. So first is survey method. So this is the common method for correlational research. So it involves random sampling of the variables or the subjects in the research in which the participants fill a questionnaire centered on the subject of interest. So it is a one quick and flexible way to collect data by asking questions. So for example, if you want to determine the relationship between the income and eating at a restaurant, you can provide questionnaire to willing participants. Next is archival data. So this involves in making use of already gathered information about the variables in correlational research. So in this method of correlational research, the research makes use of the earlier studies conducted by other researchers or the historical records of the variables being analyzed. So this method helps the researchers to track already determined statistical patterns of the variables of subjects. So this is less expensive, it saves time, and it provides the researcher with more disposable data to work with. Just like what we did on our last field methods activity, which we do a case study on certain celebrities that we choose. Lastly is the naturalistic observation. So it involves observing people's behavior as shown in the natural environment where they exist over a period of time. So this method is extremely demanding as the researcher must take extra care to ensure that the subjects do not suspect that they are being observed or watched, or else they will deviate from their natural behavioral patterns or behavior patterns. And its major advantage is that the naturalistic observation method is that it allows the researcher to fully observe the subject or the variables in their natural state. However, it is very expensive and it is time consuming. Third is to collect your data. So once you establish a method, you collect your data. So you must consider a sample size that is big enough to determine correlation. So to collect the data from your sample using the chosen research method, be sure to maintain ethical standards and obtain informed consent from your participants. Number 4 is to analyze the results. So analyzing data can help you identify if you have a positive, negative, or no correlation that was discussed by Arjun in the previous slides. So although there may be a positive or negative correlation, a third variable might still be the cause. So, for example, after studying the relationship between customer happiness and shopping in the morning, this could show shoppers have better moods because of the time of the day, or it could be due to another factor like their income or the income. So you might develop a causal hypothesis or a theory between what's causing the variables to affect one another, but it could be difficult to determine the causation without the research. Lastly is to conduct additional research. So correlational studies can create causal hypotheses, which can lead to conducting more specified research with controlled variables or additional correlational studies. So for example, a study that a coffee shop shows increased number of people drinking coffee early in the morning. So you might see or you might want to research what other factors that influence this, like the music, the staff, or the um, serve self-service resource of this coffee shop. Now we're going to discuss the purpose of correlational research. So the purpose of correlational research is to examine the relationship between two or more variables. It also determines the relationships and it makes predictions. So it allows researchers to identify whether there is a relationship between variables, and if so, it determines or the strength and directions of that relationship. So the researcher collects the data to determine whether and to what degree of relationship exists between the two or more quantifiable variables. So correlational research can be used in a variety of fields such as psychology, education, medicine, business, and sociology. Overall, the purpose of correlational research is to provide insight into the relationship between variables, which can be used to inform further research, interventions, or policy decisions. So, an example of correlational research in the field of psychology is that researchers might be interested in exploring the relationship between two variables, such as the parental attachment and anxiety levels in young adults. So, the study could involve measuring levels of attachment and anxiety using established scales or questionnaires, and then analyzing the data to determine if there is the correlation, if there is a if there is correlation between between the two variables. So this information could be useful in identifying potential risk factors for anxiety in young adults and in developing interventions that could help improve attachment or it reduce anxiety.
In the next part of the presentation is all about when to conduct correlational research. We conduct correlational research when experimental research is not possible or ethical. In some situations, it may not be possible or ethical to manipulate variables in an experimental design. In correlational research, while experimental manipulation might not always be feasible or ethical, alternative approaches still allow researchers to gain valuable insights into relationships between variables without directly intervening or manipulating them. Ethical considerations, validity, and the limitations of correlational designs should guide researchers in choosing appropriate methodologies for their investigations. In these cases, correlational research can be used to explore the relationship between variables without manipulating them. Second is when exploring new areas of research. Correlational research can be useful when exploring new areas of research or when researchers are unsure of the direction of the relationship between variables. Correlational research can help identify potential areas for further investigation. It gives a fundamental understanding of variable interactions, directing future research and hypothesis formulation in both established and emergent fields of inquiry. The third one is when testing theories. Correlational research can be useful for testing theories about the relationship between variables. Researchers can use correlational research to examine the relationship between variables predicted by a theory and to determine whether the theory is supported by the data. Correlational research is critical in the theory testing process by giving empirical information concerning links between variables provided by a specific theory. It aids in the generation of hypotheses, assessing the validity of theoretical constructs, validating predictions, and refining theories. Fourth is when making predictions. Correlational research can be used to make predictions about future behavior or outcomes. Conducting correlational research is significant in making predictions due to its ability to identify and quantify relationships between variables. For example, is that if there is a strong positive correlation between education level and income, one could predict that individuals with higher levels of education will have higher incomes. And lastly is when identifying risk factors. Correlational research can be useful for identifying potential risk factors for negative outcomes. In identifying risk factors, it's important to recognize its limitations in establishing causation. Associations found in correlational studies may not always imply a cause and effect relationship. For example, is that a study might find a positive correlation between drug use and depression, indicating that drug use could be a risk factor for depression. Next is we have the characteristics of correlational research. First, the correlational research examines the relationship between two or more variables. Correlational research is designed to examine the relationship between two or more variables. It seeks to determine if there is a relationship between the variables, and if so, the strength and direction of that relationship. Understanding these characteristics is essential for researchers when designing studies, interpreting findings, and recognizing the limitations of correlational research in establishing causation. Despite its limitations, correlational research is valuable in exploring relationships between variables and generating hypotheses for further investigation. Next is that a correlational research is a non-experimental design. Correlational research is typically non-experimental in design, meaning that the researcher does not manipulate any variables. Instead, the researcher observes and measures the variables as they naturally occur. In correlational research, there is no manipulation of variables by the researcher, unlike experimental designs where variables are intentionally manipulated to observe their effects. Correlational studies focus on observing variables as they naturally exist without intervention. Third is that it cannot establish causation. Correlational research cannot establish causation, meaning that it cannot determine whether one variable causes changes in another variable. Instead, it only provides information about the relationship between the variables. A correlation between two variables means they are related or covary in some way. However, establishing correlation alone does not imply that changes in one variable cause changes in another. There could be other factors at play, known as confounding variables, that might influence both variables independently. Correlational research uses statistical analysis. Correlational research relies on statistical analysis to determine the strength and direction of the relationship between variables. This may include calculating correlation coefficients, regression analysis, or other statistical tests. Statistical analysis is a fundamental aspect of correlational research, providing quantitative measures and insights into the relationship between variables while acknowledging the limitations inherent in establishing causation from correlational findings. Next is that it observes real-world phenomena. Correlational research is often used to observe real-world phenomena, such as the relationship between education and income or the relationship between stress and physical health. Correlational research observes real-world phenomena and identifies relationships between variables. It's, it's essential to acknowledge its limitations in establishing causation and the need for further research, including experimental studies, to confirm causal relationships in the observed phenomena. Next is that it can be conducted in a variety of fields. Correlational research can be conducted in a variety of fields, including psychology, sociology, education, and medicine. Correlational research is a very versatile strategy that is applied in a variety of sectors of study. Its adaptability enables researchers to investigate correlations between variables in many contexts like in psychology, sociology, economics, and etc. Lastly is that it can be conducted using different methods. Correlational research can be conducted using a variety of methods, including surveys, observational studies, and archival studies. Each approach of performing correlational research has its own set of pros and disadvantages. The most appropriate approach is chosen by the researchers depending on the study question, available resources, practicality, and the nature of the variables under inquiry. The approach chosen is determined by the study's goal and the sort of correlations being investigated between variables in a specific research environment, like survey questionnaires, archival studies, and observational studies, and etc. The last topic for this presentation is all about the limitations of correlational research. First is that correlational research cannot establish causation. Correlational research cannot establish causation, meaning that it cannot determine whether one variable causes changes in another variable. This is because it is not possible to control all possible confounding variables that could affect the relationship between the variables being studied. Next is the directionality problem. The directionality problem refers to the difficulty of determining which variable is influencing the other. For example, a correlation may exist between happiness and social support, but it is not clear whether social support causes happiness or whether happy people are more likely to have social support. Third variable problem. The third variable problem refers to the possibility that a third variable, not included in the study, is responsible for the observed relationship between the two variables being studied. Next is correlational research has limited generalizability. Correlational research is often limited in terms of its generalizability to other populations or settings. This is because the sample studied may not be representative of the larger population, or because the variable studied may behave differently in different contexts. Next is that it relies on self-reported data. Correlational research often relies on self-reported data, which can be subject to social desirability bias or other forms of response bias. And lastly is that it has a limited in explaining complex behaviors. Correlational research is limited in explaining complex behaviors that are influenced by multiple factors, such as personality traits, situational factors, and social contexts. And here are the links of our references. Thank you.